Now we can start to take questions, both from the floor here and also from the online audience. We'll start with people who are here, and I'll take questions in twos or threes. And when you ask your questions, can you please make sure that you give your name and your affiliation, and also keep your questions or your comments relatively brief. There's a question, and there's microphones. There's a question there, a question at the back, and then a question here. Oh, and there's, okay.
Yeah, hello. My name is Abdul Razak Kahi. I'm one of a Somaliland diaspora community member. I live in London. I've got two questions for Mr. Keating, UN Secretary General Info to Somalia. And my first question is, there's more than 20,000 African troops in Somalia, and still there's no peace. That the people in Mogadishu, they are still hiding in their places, and there's no peaceful place in the southern part of Somalia. Do you think that the Somali themselves in the south are not ready to build their country? And my second question is, I'm from Somaliland, but the time you were talking about the latest situation in Somalia, you were mostly talking about what's going on in the southern part of the country in Somalia. But we are different country. We were two countries united in 1960, and now we are in a better place than Somalia. There have been a peaceful transfer of power. There's a free and fair election in Somaliland. We call our country a most democratic country in the East Africa.
What's your question related to Somaliland?
My question is, do you follow what's going on in Somaliland, or you are ignoring about the facts on the ground? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then there was a question at the back by the screen there.
Hi, my name is Conrad Heiner. I'm a member of the International Election Observation Mission to Somaliland's recent presidential election, which I must stress is an entirely neutral mission. It takes no position on Somaliland, on recognition or anything like that. It's funded by the UK government, and we're actually launching our report on the election observation in London tomorrow. My question is to Ken. Ken, you mentioned Somaliland as a example in the region that does things differently, has good rules of the game, but you also mentioned Somaliland having slipped of late. Could you expand a little bit on that, please?
Thank you very much. And then there was a question here.
Hello. Is it on? No.
Yeah, it's on.
It's on. 1, 2, yes. Okay, my name's Wayne Green. I'm independent consultant in international relations and Global Affairs Limited, and I've had some interest in Somalia. The question I would like to say is, today, does a president have the full trust of the Somali people of Somalia? And can the UN guarantee that there will be a free election, one person, one vote, as promised in the next presidential election?
Thank you very much. I think, Michael, quite a few of these questions are directed to you, but we'll make sure other people answer as well. Have you got?
Sure, I'll be very brief. So, I mean, on the question about, are Somalis ready to build their own security and security forces and peace? I think the answer probably has to be no. I don't think either the political agreements are in place, nor are the institutional or operational capacities available for Somalis, particularly in southwest, to assume those responsibilities. The good news is the government is very straight up about this. I mean, the government took the brave step a few months ago to undertake, with the support of some partners, including the UN, something called an Operational Readiness Assessment, an ORA, which is a very kind of long-winded way of saying they did a kind of audit of the capacity of Somali forces. And it has revealed that the Somali army and indeed the Somali police are simply not in a position to assume responsibility for these things for any number of reasons. Some of them very obvious and to do with training and equipment and so on. but some of them, it's not so explicitly stated, is that there simply isn't sufficient political consensus whereby these forces are trusted. And so there's a long way to go before Somali security forces are both able, acceptable to the population, accountable, where there's clarity about to whom they are accountable, and affordable. So the answer is no. In terms of visits to Somaliland, I go up there quite often. I've had meetings with President Solano, with President Bihi. One of the things I had to research, because I was asked the same question as you've just asked, is why does the UN ignore Somaliland? By the way, when I go to Kismayo, I'm asked, why does the UN ignore Kismayo? When I go to Belatwain, they say, why does the UN ignore Belatwain? And everybody feels that they're being ignored. But we did do some research into where the UN is deploying people, spending money and all the rest of it. And Somaliland actually gets more than, depending on how you measure the population, but more than its sort of share. So we certainly, one of the things that we are really supporting is the idea that there should be a negotiated, there should be a process of negotiation between Somaliland and Somalia to sort out its problems, because whatever the final status of Somaliland, it must be the result of negotiations. I don't think violence is going to get us there. The other question was, can the UN, does the President have full confidence of the people? Does the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom have the full confidence of the people? Does the President of the United States? No, the answer is no, not the full confidence. But I think there's a... What's that?
There's a different context here to Somalia.
We can talk about that later. Yes, but I mean, of course, the president, as Mary said, it was amazing how popular his election was. He's just done this tour of the northern areas, which arguably is more friendly towards him than some other parts, but that went extremely well. So I think he, and there have been a few setbacks, but every president, every prime minister tends to enjoy a honeymoon period followed by a bit of a dip. And that's no different in Somalia. Can the UN guarantee one person, one vote elections? I think it's, behind your question is a number of assumptions. I don't think it's our job to guarantee one person, one vote elections. Our job is, the Somalis have collectively written a memo to themselves. We will have one person, one vote elections in 2020, 2021. Our job is to work with the Somalis at the federal level, state level, district level, to figure out how that can actually happen. What needs to be in place if that prospect is to be realized? And again, as with everything in Somalia, it requires political agreements on the electoral model. It requires agreements on how you're going to do voter registration. It requires agreements on the size of the constituency. Is it going to be district, state, national? What kind of, is it going to be proportional representation? Is it going to be closed list? Is it going to be open list? And all these things are political negotiations. And of course, because Somalia is still very clan-based, every clan is looking at each of these options from the perspective of which one is going to be most advantageous to them. So the point I would make is that, and it actually speaks to something that Sarah said, one of the things that we want to do better is apply conflict prevention and conflict resolution methodologies to processes like electoral reform, constitutional review, building an army and a police force. I mean, one of the lessons of Somalia is that if people are left out, you will pay a price for that. Maybe not immediately. Elite deals that exclude minority groups or marginalized groups will not hold eventually. So in this moment of opportunity to build institutions, if we have got to get the design right, and I don't think we do enough in this kind of thing to draw upon the lessons we've learned around the world and in Somalia in the way we go about these things.
Can I just underscore what Michael said, because I think this is something we've seen in country after country as they sort of struggle on this transition towards greater stability, whether it is post-conflict. It's a very ambiguous term, when a country is really in a post-conflict phase. But elections become a yardstick for the international community to measure the success of a country, which very often actually aggravates some of the tensions. And I think what Michael is saying is very important because, having a date the international community would like to see earlier rather than sooner rather than later, in many ways could be counter to the process of stability in the country, and the importance of really getting the process right and ensuring that the Somalis have the time to think about what is the best process to get there, what is the best process of constitutional reform, that they really have the time to design the process that is best fit for them. And our role as international partners is to support that process externally, not to kind of force them into a certain, on a certain path that we design on the basis of our, technocratic solutions that we have designed, somewhere in the West. But we really accompany, that process, sensitively and intelligently.
Thank you very much. And I think, Ken, can we just turn to you with Conrad's question, which was about, you mentioned that some aspects of Somaliland's relatively successful situation have started to slip. If you could elaborate on that.
I could, if you would bear with me, I'd love to piggyback on something that Michael alluded to a minute ago, and that also ties into something that Rashid was talking about first, and that is this notion of lack of inclusivity in governance and in peace accords and in resource sharing, ultimately always undermining a compact or an alliance or a government. And I think that's really important because whether they're minority groups or just clans that feel that they've been marginalized, one of the realities in Somalia is that those aggrieved groups have easy recourse to essentially the role of spoiler by turning to al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has been very, very effective at taking advantage of these kinds of clan grievances. And what's important about that is that that's a political problem, not a military problem. In order to shrink Shabaab's reach into clans and its temporary alliances that it exploits, Somali politicians have to address the grievances. And if they do, then there's still going to be huge pressure, as Rashid said, for the Somali National Army to be put up to speed so that it can replace AMISOM. But it'll at least reduce some of the pressure on them if we can come up with some of these political solutions. Now, on to Somaliland. First of all, foreigners who speak about Somaliland are immediately in grave danger of being criticized and attacked on all sides. So I'm going to try to be very careful about this. Whether you support Somaliland's current status as a self-declared independent state or you don't, you have to recognize the enormous success that it has had over the past quarter century of keeping the peace and allowing for a chunk of territory where 3 million or so people have been able to live their lives in security and with some degree of economic recovery for a quarter of a century. And that is something we have to be very attentive not to allow to backslide. That would be a huge shame if that occurred because we weren't paying attention to Somaliland. We weren't trying to help as best we could continue to stabilize that zone of economic recovery, democracy, and stability. Why I say that there has been backsliding, I think all Somalilanders and anyone else who's been there know this, but there has been deterioration over the years in terms of, first of all, again, deinstitutionalization. We have seen the government shrink to a smaller and smaller circle of family members around the former president, Silano, the disproportionate influence of a handful of large companies operating in Somaliland that really disempowered the population, high levels of corruption that discouraged a lot of Somalilanders, creeping authoritarianism at one point, slippage on civil liberties and the free press and freedom of assembly. And then for me, one of the things that worried me the most the last time I was there was just the level of clanism that has survived and in some ways gotten worse in Somaliland was discouraging. You see this in big ways and small. I mean, different neighborhoods are all carved up by sub-clan, where you can and can't buy a house, where you can and can't set up a business. Every clan has got their own university. Every sub-clan has got their own bottled water company. What I saw was less of a sense of Somaliland identity than I have seen in the past, and more slippage to subclanism. Now, that may be temporary. I hope it's temporary. I hope the recent election has helped to reverse that, but that's never a good sign. And when you combine that with some other, I think, systemic problems in Somaliland, 80% urban unemployment in Hargeisa, the rise of gangs, which so far haven't been too violent, but they're pretty ubiquitous. They're causing more and more trouble. I worry about those things, and I hope that Somaliland can engage in a course correction on them for the sake of the 3 million or so people who live there.
Thanks very much, Ken. I'll come back to the floor very soon, but just to give our viewers and listeners online a chance to ask some questions. They've sent lots of them. So I will start from a question from Jok Maduk Jok, which seems like a South Sudanese name, which is great. Thanks for taking part in this conversation. And maybe this one could be for Rashid. His question is Ethiopia undermining development in Somalia by reducing cross-border river water through its construction of dams? Does the international community need to step in? So maybe, Rashid, you could talk about that and maybe a little bit more about Ethiopia's relationship with Somalia. And then we also have a question from our man on the Horn, who I know who he is. I don't know if anyone else does. Anyway, he's someone who works in Mogadishu. He says, where does the panel see al-Shabaab in the future of Somalia? And how do we reconcile the innate appeal of its nationalist Islamist agenda to many Somalis and even parts of the government itself? Maybe, Rashid, you could comment on that as well. I hope you can hear what I'm saying. And then there's one more question, which comes from an unnamed person in an unnamed place, which says, what does the panel think about the calls of the Somali Prime Minister to accelerate debt relief to fight terrorism? So maybe, Rashid, if we could start with you to talk about Ethiopia and I suppose the innate appeal, as our man in the Horn sees it, of al-Shabaab to people even within the government itself.
Yes. I'm not an expert on the environment, so a lot of what I'm going to say is actually speculative. But clearly, anyone who has followed Somalia, especially southern Somalia, will know that many of the perennial rivers are drying up. Southern Somalia is now devastated in terms of environmental, degradation. And clearly, the Shabelle and the Juba are the two main rivers in South Somalia. Much of the agriculture, subsistence agriculture in central Somalia actually rests on the availability of water. The water levels have been declining. Now, whether that may be the result of environmental changes, climate, global warming, I really don't know. I am very skeptical about the idea that Ethiopia is deliberately diverting water away from Somalia. However, I think it is time for the government in Mogadishu and also the government in Addis Ababa to begin also to debate the availability, these river issues and water resources. Clearly, water resources isn't only the Nile. There are many rivers that flow from the Ethiopian highlands on which, South Somalia depends. And I remember a lecture Professor Ken gave many years ago in which he actually stressed this point that, it is time for these resource issues to be part of the diplomatic, discourse and engagement with Ethiopia. Regarding al-Shabaab, I think we haven't spoken a lot about al-Shabaab in this debate today, but I just want to stress that al-Shabaab remains a serious threat to Somalia. And actually, al-Shabaab is on the resurgence. It really is threatening many of the major towns. including Kismayo, including South Central Somalia, but also Mogadishu. And unless Somalia's national army and the security services get better, the danger is al-Shabaab will progressively, move into these cities and regain control. And we keep on stressing, and we should actually reiterate again, that as long as the government does not deal with conflict issues, with local governance, improving local governance, especially the discord between the subclans, al-Shabaab will continue to exploit those differences to rebuild its strength. And we see that happening in many parts of Somalia.
The question in terms of what our man on the horn describes as the innate appeal of al-Shabaab's nationalist Islamist agenda to so many people in Somalia, including, he says, people in the government.
That is a difficult question because no doubt there is a strong Islamist component in the current government, in especially senior positions of leadership. Also, we know that there are shadowy Islamist groups that have been competing for power in Somalia for a number of years. Now, the way in which Islamist politicians have maneuvered in the last decade is actually to prop up politicians or to basically work with secular leaders. My suspicion or my fear is that as Somalia moves towards the one man, one vote, many of these shadow Islamist groups will come out into the open, and it will, I think, given their organization and resources, it is highly likely that in any free election, an Islamist party will come to government. Now, whether that is a bad thing, I really don't know. But yes, Islamism remains a very popular, force, organizing principle in Somali politics. It's not going to go away. And a lot of that is also laced with a certain nationalist narrative as well.
Thank you very much, Rashid. I wonder, Michael, do you want to talk about the issue of debt relief briefly? Or shall I pass that to someone else?
Yeah, no, well, the question was, what do we think of the Prime Minister invoking debt relief as a means of defeating al-Shabaab? Of all the reasons deployed to campaign for debt relief, that is not the one that is most usually, used. But I can see where he's coming from, because I think what he's basically saying is that unless the country can start providing basic services to the population, including, in particular, health and education and basic infrastructure, vocational training, job opportunities, public works, then the country remains perennially vulnerable to extremism. So I think that is an issue. If I can just build on or react to something that Rashid has just said, I think, again, there are many Somalis in the room, so I say this, I'm happy to be contradicted, but I think if, one of the lessons of Somalia over the last few decades is that a clandestine state capture program is likely to result in further violence and conflict. State capture, whether it's by private business interests or ideological interests, is really a recipe for continued conflict. So I think the challenge is, how do you maintain political space? How do you continue to ensure that everybody can be included in the conversation? And I don't think this is a complete mystery, by the way. I think there are a number of ways in which this can be done. Clearly federalism is not everybody's cup of tea, but one of the things that I point to when I have this conversation is that federalism is basically what you make of it. I mean, it's interesting, the Emirates, the federal government exists at the pleasure of the 7 Emirates. That's where it gets its money from, its legitimacy from. In other places, it's the other way around. the federal member states exist because the federal government is prepared to devolve powers. Somalia's got to figure out where on this spectrum it wants to be, whether it comes to security, whether it comes to taxation, whether it comes to things like revenue collection, resource sharing, concessions, and so on. And I think the important thing is that conversation about where Somalia wants to be must be maintained and should not be suppressed. It should not become a clandestine conversation. And I think there are a number of things that can be done to ensure that it remains open and public. And one of the things that I urge partners in the international community is to respond to the many Somalis who say to me, how do we continue to ensure openness in this discussion? Because anything else is going to take us down a very complicated path.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more lot of questions. So we could have. Did you want to ask a question?
Very quick.
Just hold on, and then we'll have here, and then the gentleman at the back, and then you. Yeah. So maybe if we can start with you. Thank you. And remember to give your name and your affiliation. And please keep the questions really brief. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Abdinasir Ismail, Somali journalist based here in London. When Somali Parliament rejected recently the deal between United Arab Emirates, Somaliland and Ethiopia, the CEO of the DP World, Sultan bin Sulaiman, said Somali government has nothing to do with the new agreement, recognizing self-parliament state of Somaliland is an independent country for 28 years. Ironically, a couple of days before that, he was complaining about Djibouti seizing illegally one of the DP Worlds in Djibouti. To the panel thing, United Arab Emirates is causing regional unrest and tensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then there was here.
Thank you. I'm Laura Hammond from SOAS, University of London. Michael, I guess this question is primarily aimed at you, but and it follows on from your last comment, which was about having the conversation around the relationship between centre and federal units of governance be public, be transparent, and how. So my question is, how much does the process of constitutional reform have to do with that, and is that still a major priority of this government, or is what seems to somewhat be happening as a kind of peeling off of different kinds of debates into separate discussions, and the danger then is there that they don't come back together or that they don't remain in the public domain for debate. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Thank you. And there was a gentleman at the back.
Mohammed Shire, independent consultant. My question goes to, I think, Michael and also to Professor Ken. It's to do with the political violence that's been talked about. For Ken, how do you see this coming to an end? There's been extreme political violence in the Somali context lately. And what's the role of the UN in terms of dealing with or curbing the recent political violence? And my other question is to do with the transition. Michael touched upon the fact that the Somalis are not capable, the Somali National Army or Somali forces are not capable meeting the security needs of the Somalis. If that's the case, are we admitting failure of the transition plan completely, that the government also put forward a draft transition plan? Are we admitting a failure in that? And what was the, sorry, and the other point I want to raise about the London conference, there's been a security architect and a security pact. Is that all lost? That's
Thanks very much. And then we'll just take one more. There's a gentleman at the back there. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Saeed Gele. I am a Somali citizen living in London, one of the diaspora, Somali diaspora. My question is, Katie, it is about Somali sovereignty, Somalia sovereignty and unity. Recently, the the federal state of Somalia has been having an issue relating to the intervention of foreign countries in their internal resources. And among those issues are, Somali parliament consisting of, MPs that represent every corner of Somalia. Among them are, members from Somaliland itself, and also the other tribes of Somalia. When is the Somali government and the UN mission will recognize that Somalia is a sovereignty country and will keep its territorial integrity, and talk to Somaliland government as one tribe among Somalis who have power sharing members in the Somali government? That's my question.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Michael, there's a lot of questions put to you. Do you want to address them? And then we'll quickly
unless you
go
want
around.
to ask Ken or
But
Sarah Rashid to answer.
you go first, and then we'll go around the other panelists, if that's okay. And just keep it as brief as you can.
Okay, brief as I can. There have been many other deals. This is relating to the Berbera port deal, which everybody is very exercised about. The funny thing is there have been many deals over the last 5 years of various kinds in Somaliland. And the Somali government has more or less gone along with them. It hasn't raised an objection, partly because the position of the last Somali government, and indeed of this Somali government, and the president's on record as saying this, is that he has no problem with activities that promote economic growth, that build infrastructure, that allow anyone in what he considers to be Somalia, including Somaliland, to improve their lives and their security. I think the issue is that there was no consultation with Somalia in a way that there had been in the last 5 years, very informal as it was. I think there was also an issue of the timing of the announcement of the deal, which was most unfortunate. I mean, the Prime Minister of Somalia happened to be in Abu Dhabi when it was announced. That actually forced the Prime Minister, for understandable reasons, to denounce it, which then resulted in the thing that you referred about, the DP World people, who are essentially a company making a very political statement and raising questions as to whether that statement by the company represented the official views of the government of the Emirates. That question has not been answered. The point is that Somaliland, whether we like it or not, is not recognized by the African Union as an independent state, nor is it recognized by the UN as an independent entity. And ultimately, the status of Somaliland must be decided by Somalis themselves through a proper negotiated process. And both Bihi and Farmajo are committed to that. They have told me personally, and they have put it out there, that they want that discussion to take place. The question is, how can you organize that discussion when every time you think you're getting close to beginning a conversation, there's some other drama that fires everybody up and puts the leaders into a very difficult position in which it's very awkward for them to be seen as engaging in these discussions. The fact that I said that the Somali National Army is not ready does not at all mean that the transition plan is irrelevant or redundant. I made the point that it was very brave of the government of Somalia to do an assessment of the capability of its security forces. I think that's great. They've now got a baseline. It means you've got a baseline for the transition plan. If anything, it makes the transition plan more meaningful. So that's the way I would answer that question. There's a long way to go on the transition plan. When will the UN, what was it, Somali sovereignty and unity, when will the Somali government... Sorry, the what?
Let's leave that one for Ken.
Okay,
I think, how
ahead.
about the constitution?
Oh, the constitutional one, Laura's question. Yes. I mean, this happens to be the latest political agenda of the government of Somalia. It's online. It's called, it came out a couple of weeks ago. The first item on it is federalization and the constitutional review process. It is officially the top priority of the federal government of Somalia. There are lots of problems in pursuing this constitutional review process, and there are those who say, oh, we can do the whole thing in the next year. There are others who say you can never do it until the status of Somaliland is sorted out, until the status of Benadir is sorted out, and then there's people all along the spectrum. I suspect that what we're going to see is a commitment to this process once roles and responsibilities for it have been sorted out, and it's already been 6-month discussion about that. What's the respective role of the government, of the Joint Oversight Committee of Parliament, of the Independent Commission on the Review of the Constitution? So there's a real argument about whose role is it to move this forward and what should they do. Once that's sorted out, you then start the process around the country. I think what people are realizing is that you can't wait for the constitutional review process to be completed. A number of interim agreements need to be put in place relating to security, relating to resource and revenue sharing, relating to, concessions and all sorts of other things. You can't say, let's wait to the end of this thing and then we'll sort these things out. You've got to maintain momentum. So I see a 2-track thing. One is pursuit of this very complicated process at the same time as a number of interim agreements that will allow the conversation to continue and will allow the federal process to develop a stronger substructure.
Thank you, Michael. Ken, there was a question for you about political violence and how it could...
Would you mind repeating that? I had a very loud lawnmower go past my window repeatedly while he was speaking. I didn't hear a thing.
It was basically about, how you can bring it to an end, all of these different forms of political violence. And does the UN have any part to play in that?
Oh, I forgot to answer that.
Don't worry. It's okay.
How the political violence will end. I would go back to the observation that I made earlier about rules of the game. Every country, every society, communities even within countries have different rules of the game about when political violence is legitimate or usable and when it's not. And those rules change over time. One of the things that's impressed me in Somalia is how quickly those rules can change in a particular location. A city that or town that's been very violent, then suddenly a new agreement is reached and there's very little political violence. And of course, the reversal, the backsliding is also the case. My hope is that the political violence will end by generational changes in Somalia. Once you've got habits of the use of political violence, as ubiquitous as they are in Somalia now, they're going to be hard to break. But there's a new generation in Somalia. 75% of the population's under the age of 30. And the hope is that they can mobilize and start to change the rules of the game among themselves. But it'll take time. It'll be slow. It's going to require a lot of socialization of Somalis, of themselves. I don't know that the internationals of any sort, whether the UN or other international actors, have a really significant role in that. That's an internal discussion.
Thank you, Ken. Rashid, do you have any brief reflections on those questions before we wrap up?
I would like to concur with His Excellency, the SRSG, about the UAE. I think right now, if you are following developments in Mogadishu, it is the hot topic. The president of Somaliland has just flown to the UAE. The president of Somalia plans to go probably tomorrow to Qatar. So the whole geopolitics of this crisis, is spilling over into Somalia and causing a lot of destabilization. But again, I also followed the leadership in Mogadishu because clearly they have lost sight of what their interest is. Their interest is actually to win over Somaliland, to build a strategic partnership with Somaliland, and to progressively find a settlement to the final status issues. Right now, the way they are behaving is actually alienating Somaliland.
Thank you, Rashid. And basically, we have run out of time. But before we go, I'd like to thank everybody who's been watching and listening online, wherever you are in the world, all of you for coming. And just very briefly, if each member of the panel could give their sort of final reflections, just 1 or 2 sentences each. That would be great. So maybe, Michael, if you could just give a very, very brief thoughts for people to take away.
You began by talking about the enthusiasm of the government, and then by implication you were saying, oh, well, we're now in a totally different space and everything is going pear-shaped. I think that's a pretty tough interpretation of what's going on. I still think we are in a moment of opportunity. I think there's, despite the challenges, despite the vulnerability of Somali politics to corruption, to interference, I think there is still hope that that this agenda of the government can be fulfilled. My thought, and by the way, what is the alternative to this? I mean, that's, I think we've got a government now that is probably the best we've had in a while. I don't see what the alternative is. I think the key thing is for Somalis to talk to themselves in a respectful way. Failure to do that is making them very vulnerable, including to being part of a broader geopolitical game, which is not going to be good for the people of Somalia in addressing their many problems, whether they're humanitarian, development, or security related.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Sarah?
I'd like to echo what Michael said, and also offer a reminder to us as the friends of Somalia, the partners are supposed to support the Somalis. I think we have a tendency as international partners to always wanted to see quick results. I often say that it took my country 70 years after the end of the civil war in Italy with the Second World War to finally contemplate the idea of electing somebody who was not related to the fascist regime. And yet, in these countries we expect, people to move on, their traumas and the societal divisions really quickly. So it's for us to have the patience to allow the Somalis to work through these divisions, to overcome the trauma, to overcome the difficulties, to rebuild their society, supporting them, with intelligence and patience, and giving, if there is anything we can do, is help create the space for dialogue, sort of support them quietly and without sort of hurrying them too much, and making sure that the dialogue is not just at the central level, the federal level, but it's also local. It's really looking. We're talking about the causes of political violence. There are so many different causes. Looking at what is pushing the youth is so disillusioned, looking at the differences between the clans, looking at the challenges around the sense of injustice and grievance. It's all of that that needs to find the space to be addressed and healed.
Thank you very much. Ken, perhaps we could hear your final brief thoughts.
I would say that business as usual in Somalia is not an option, though I agree with Sarah that generally we need to be patient and give time and space. Somalia doesn't have a lot of time right now, particularly if AMISOM does continue its withdrawal. The kleptocracy that has emerged in the country is robbing the Somali National Army of, among other things, salaries for its soldiers. If they go unpaid, they desert or defect, and there's no chance of standing up that Somali National Army in time to provide the protection that is going to be needed as AMISOM withdraws.
Thank you, Ken. And finally, Rashid?
Yes, I think I will agree with everything that has been said. Just one comment, which is the current government in Somalia should be a national reconciliation government. It should stop behaving like the governments of Siad Barre. It is not a hard government. Its desire is to build relationships, to also rebuild the country. And the way and the window is very narrow. If they continue behaving the way they are doing, they are basically going to lose this transition, and we will also have another transitional government.
Well, those are tough words to end with, but don't forget Michael's optimism, which I think is very much needed, as well as, and I'd just like to thank all of you for coming here today. There'll be a video recording of the event will be available tomorrow, and also there's some tea and coffee available, so anyone who wants to continue with the conversations, please stay behind. So thank you very much for everyone.